Thank you, everybody, for being here with me today. We have a new guest in our Policymaker Corner, and with Professor Mayo. After hosting a very important speaker such as Professor Baldwin a couple of months ago, we are now discussing another topic, which is, if you follow us at Consumer Choice Center on social network, is very, very important right now for not just the Mexican consumers, but all the consumers around the world. And this is actually the content quota. So I want to introduce our speaker of today, Professor Mayo, from microeconomics professor at Georgetown University. Thank you for being here today with us.
It's a pleasure.
I would say let's start immediately. We just finished right now a panel on the idea of imposing domestic content quota on OTT providers in Mexico this time. Something similar has been made in European Union last year. Before we jump on the specific issue, can you give us a sense on how economists think about this, and there is any economic explanation on this type of law?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First, before jumping into the answer, let me thank you, Luca, for hosting me, for having me. I've been a student of the Mexican audiovisual industry for a number of years now, and it's an exciting young industry, and I think it's got lots of potential in this market. And so it's especially nice to have the idea that economics will matter in this industry, and getting the economic policy right in this industry matters. So thank you very much for having me. Let me say just a couple of things about how economists view markets like this and policy issues like this by way of just framing the issues. Number one, a cautionary tale, I think, and that is that policymakers should be very careful not to simply adopt or eschew policy proposals like this based simply on political ideology. Economics has shown over and over again that it's possible for regulation to benefit markets, but it's also the case that, and it has been shown, that regulation has the potential for not benefiting markets. And so it's not a matter of ideology of regulation is always good or free markets are always good, but rather it's a case that, and I think this is the case at hand, that's going to involve really putting an economic lens on it, not a political ideology lens, to move the industry forward in a smart fashion. The second sort of cautionary tale or framing point I'd make is that we ought not to just simply jump to policy proposals simply because they are well-intentioned. The proposal at hand, the domestic content quota legislation that I understand is being considered, can certainly be framed as one that is well-intentioned, desire to help support the domestic industry. But the merits of a policy proposal ought not to turn on whether a proposal is well-intentioned or not, but rather on what policy approach works best. What policy approach works best to the development of a healthy, in this case, audiovisual industry? And the answers to that, again, will require not just simply an assessment of whether the proposal is well-intentioned, but also an assessment of what are the economics, what economic policies actually will work best for the industry.
All right, thank you very much. That was actually very interesting. And I think we can actually see that in, at least on the consumer's perspective, we represent consumers all over the world. This market is very competitive, the ones of audiovisual streaming service and not only. So do you believe there is any baseline understanding in the economics community when it's appropriate to impose a regulation such as this one of domestic content quota on a so competitive market, or the risk is actually the opposite, so to actually close the market?
That's a great question. In the case at hand, the audiovisual industry in Mexico is young. It's growing. Consumers, I think, are just now finding their way into this marketplace. And maybe for policymakers, it's a little scary to think about how this is going to turn out for the consumers and for the Mexican economy. The temptation in that sort of world, when things get scary, is to just simply jump in with a governmental policy. Economics has shown that sort of preemptive move is often really counterproductive and really requires a precursor question. The precursor question is, has there been or are there signs of a market failure in this industry? Is the industry, in the absence of the proposal, failing to benefit consumers? Or are consumers benefiting, and is there an expectation that they'll continue to benefit without the policy proposal?
I would love to discuss about the market failure much more, because we have a lot of examples in Europe, but today's conversation is actually in Mexico, so I come back to the point. And the audiovisual law that was presented in the Senate last February. Is it your understanding that there is an evidence of a market failure in Mexico? In our perspective at Consumer Choice Center, there is none, but what is the economics perspective of this?
No, I haven't seen any evidence at all, none really, that this is a market that is exhibiting market failures. In contrast, I think there's ample evidence that the market is working really quite well. If you look at the demand side of this market, what you see is that demand in Mexico is growing very, very rapidly, 67% over the last period that was assessed in the financial literature. And the projections are for very, very robust demand growth. Importantly, over on the supply side, the response has been robust. You've seen 96 platforms emerge. That's a huge growth in consumer choice that's benefiting consumers. The result of all these platforms coming online has been that there's been a tremendous increase in competition by the OTT providers, the over-the-top providers, to compete for consumers. And the result of that competition has been that there's a competition for eyeballs. There's a competition that OTT providers have to improve the quality of their service, to improve the financial attractiveness of their offerings, to increase innovative programming, and to tailor their offerings to the demands for Mexican consumers. So I think the bottom line here is that the market itself is showing robust signs of working very well.
I would like to add that in Mexico, there is more OTT services than in most of the countries in Europe, including France or Italy. So that's actually, coming from Italy, I can say that Mexico is actually much more advanced in this, let's say, consumer choice and competition than actually some European countries. So obviously, I don't want to speculate on the Mexican politics, but what do you believe could be the reason for, how do you explain the push for this type of legislation? What do you think could be the reason behind the decision to push for this, especially a few months before the elections?
Well, you've got this possible concern about the emergence of, or the availability of domestic content in Mexico. I think that precipitates a couple of different questions. Number one, is there in fact a shortage? Is there just in fact a shortage of Mexican content available in Mexico? And there, I understand that there have been studies done that look at Mexican titles, and my understanding is that of the most popular Mexican titles, well over 70, maybe 80% of those really popular Mexican titles are already available on one or more of the over-the-top platform venues. So it's not altogether clear that there is a shortage. Moreover, I think the second question is, are there conditions, economic conditions, are the economic conditions in Mexico suitable for enabling the production of domestic content? And here I think the answer from an economic perspective is yes, economic conditions are actually quite right for the production of domestic content in the event that it's warranted. Mexico is a large country, population of 130 million people. That makes it very ripe for production in Mexico. And as you just mentioned a moment ago, Luca, the competition among providers is creating a what economists would refer to as a virtuous cycle in which if there is demand, there's a supply response, there's investment, there's a production in high quality content that leads consumers to gravitate toward that particular platform, and other platforms compete by for those same customers by trying themselves to offer high quality content. And we've seen evidence of that competition in the marketplace in Mexico. Companies in Mexico have stepped up to meet various demands for domestic content. Notably, Amazon, I think, has most recently indicated that it will invest $300 million in original domestic content productions in Mexico with a goal of 50 original productions. Same thing is happening over at Disney. Disney has made announcements of local productions in both Latin America and Mexico in particular. HBO Max has also done that. So it's not simply a story of what might happen, but a story of what is actually happening. So I think while there is a concern about domestic content that has been raised, all indications are the market's responding robustly to demands for domestic content.
Well, you actually exactly went to the point of my next question, but was what could be the effects on the domestic economy of Mexico if this law passes? Because I believe that obviously if 15% of the content quota must be done by a Mexican-owned company, which is what the legislation right now said, the proposed legislation said, the risk is that all the company that you just mentioned and many others that work in that industry will not invest in Mexico anymore. Do you think it could lead to this? Do you think it could come to it could indicate, there is any economics analysis that indicate what are the effects of this legislation on the GDP and especially coming from a terrible year like 2020 and mostly 2021?
So I haven't seen a complete detailed analysis of what the impacts might be of the passage of this sort of legislation on the Mexican GDP. That said, there are both conceptual reasons and practical indications that there would be harm to the Mexican economy if the proposal were to move forward. On a conceptual side, understand that what you're doing is putting in place a set of content quotas that eliminate that healthy incentive that I just spoke about a moment ago of investment leading to consumers demanding the product, which leads to more investment and more innovation. Here, what you're doing is forcing, with this proposal, forcing a particular level of content. And you might think instead of this virtuous cycle, imagine, just play out the scenario in this case. If you were to impose, let's say, a 15% domestic content quota on audiovisual services in Mexico, the most simple way for the firms to satisfy that would be to simply reduce their non-domestic content catalog down to a level that would satisfy the legislation. That is to say, they could simply satisfy the requirement by reducing the quality of their offering. They could reduce the quality of their offering. Now, that would be perverse to say, okay, this is a policy that leads to reduced investment and reduced quality. So the legislation itself recognizes that it imposes an incentive for reduced quality by then layering an additional regulatory requirement into the legislation, and which says you can't, in fact, satisfy this requirement by reducing the number of non-domestic content on the, or reducing your catalog. So think about what that really says. It says that you've introduced a measure that creates an incentive to reduce quality. And then in order to stop firms from reducing quality that you've introduced, you have to introduce yet another regulation that itself doesn't change the incentives to reduce quality. So on a sort of economic theory basis, there are considerable concerns about the passage of this legislation. Now, in a practical sense, and that is really what you were asking about as well, on a practical basis, the question is, what do we know from the economics community about the impact of domestic content quotas when they have been imposed? And there have been a number of economic studies that have been done. The most recent one that I'm aware of by Professor Raoul Katz at Columbia University and a co-author, Juan Young, examined the impact of this sort of legislation, domestic content quota legislation, relative to alternative ways of stimulating an industry. And what they found was that alternatives, other than the type of heavy-handed approach being proposed by domestic content quota regulation, leads to actually more domestic titles as a result. And so the actual economic impact of this sort of proposal winds up being perverse. It winds up actually harming consumers.
Well, thank you very much. And you actually answered also my next question. So I just want to comment that a good example of this perverse incentive is actually in France. They impose a quota on music. So 30% of the music in radio must be French. So when we impose it, basically everyone ran to do music, obviously, and songs in French. But if you listen to them, there is no innovation, there is no quality. It's all the same rhythms, all the same type of song, basically different type of words, but it's always the same, reproducing all the time. And also the foreigner music diminish, because if you have obviously to have a quota of 30%, you remove some American, some Italian music from the radio, and you run more often the French one. So consumers in France got less choice, and some radios actually had to close because we were completely, for example, in English, which is terrible if you think that the radio is actually very important. So yeah, that happens in Europe. No. One last question for this interview is, well, we have discussed about Mexico, but Mexico just signed FACTA, let's say the successor of FACTA, USCMA, which is starting now to enter into force. So what's the risk if this content quota starts? I mean, you mentioned some investors that invested now in Mexico, and they are mainly all US companies. So is there a risk which is a very dangerous precedent for Mexican trade agreements with US or any other large market in the world, including, for example, European Union? Or do you think that this quota will not, this legislation will not impact in any way the trade agreements?
Yeah, I think, again, that's a very good question. like a lot of other economists all over the world, really, that have looked at the design and passage of the USMCA, I think we were really quite excited about the idea of bringing a trade agreement forward, NAFTA being the seminal agreement, but bringing the agreement forward to deal with modern industries like the audiovisual industry that we're talking about right now. There's a tremendous upside for agreements like the USMCA to facilitate sort of more seamless flow of goods and services across North America, across Canada, Mexico, and the United States. That has tremendous promise to lift up the well-being of consumers throughout North America. I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that the proposed legislation here that would impose domestic content quotas is a violation of both the spirit and certainly the letter of the USMCA as well. It violates the sort of economic principles involved that allow for a more seamless flow of investment in audiovisual services across North America. And I think that'll be good if we move forward with the USMCA implemented in its strictest terms. And my understanding is that if you implement that as it is written, it is not consistent with the domestic content quota legislation. But if you implement that, then there's a great potential for benefits for Mexican consumers, the Mexican economy generally, as well as for North America more generally.
Professor Mayo, thank you very much for being with us today. It was a real pleasure, and let's hope to have more conversation with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.